This legendary 1962 epic became Hollywood's most notorious production disaster, featuring a star who hijacked the director's chair, a co-star fired for alcoholism who vanished mid-movie, death scenes filmed on beds of ice, and a leading man who married both Tahitian actresses from different Bounty films. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Mutiny on the Bounty. Fact 1. First ultra-Panavision film. When Mutiny on the Bounty hit theaters in 1962, audiences witnessed something that had never existed before in cinema history. This epic sea adventure became the very first motion picture ever filmed using the revolutionary ultra-Panavision 70 widescreen process, creating an incredibly wide aspect ratio of 2.76:1 that stretched across theater screens like nothing moviegoers had ever seen. The story behind this groundbreaking technology begins in the late 1950s when Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer approached Panavision founder Robert Gottschalk with an ambitious request. The studio wanted to create a large-format widescreen system that could fill the extremely wide screens used in Cinerama theaters, while using just a single projector, instead of the complicated 3-projector setup that Cinerama required. Gottschalk developed a special lens system using front-mounted prisms that squeezed the image by 1.25 times onto 65mm film negative, resulting in that remarkably wide projected ratio. Initially, this system was called MGM Camera 65 and was first used on films like Ben-Hur in 1959. However, when Mutiny on the Bounty ran so far over budget that it nearly bankrupted MGM, the studio was forced to sell off many of its assets to cover the massive losses. This financial disaster actually allowed Panavision to purchase the Camera 65 equipment they had originally developed for MGM, and they renamed the entire system Ultra Panavision 70. The irony is perfect. The very film that introduced this revolutionary widescreen technology to the world was also the production disaster that allowed the technology to change hands and get its famous name. Mutiny on the Bounty literally created its own legacy in cinema history through both technical innovation and financial catastrophe. Fact 2. Brando chose Tahiti over Lawrence. Marlon Brando faced one of the most significant career decisions in Hollywood history when he was simultaneously offered 2 legendary roles that would define 1960s cinema. Director David Lean personally offered Brando the title role in Lawrence of Arabia, while MGM was courting him to play Fletcher Christian in their lavish remake of Mutiny on the Bounty. Both films promised to be epic productions with massive budgets and prestigious directors, but Brando's choice came down to something surprisingly simple: location preferences. When Brando met with David Lean in Paris to discuss Lawrence of Arabia, he discovered that the film would require 6 months of shooting in the harsh desert conditions of Jordan and Spain. The prospect of spending half a year filming under the blazing desert sun, dealing with sand, extreme temperatures, and the isolation of remote desert locations simply didn't appeal to the actor who had long been fascinated by the South Pacific. In his autobiography, Brando explained his reasoning with characteristic bluntness, writing that while Lean was a very good director, he took so long to make movies that Brando would have dried up in the desert like a puddle of water. Instead, when MGM offered him the Fletcher Christian role with filming scheduled for the tropical paradise of Tahiti, the choice became obvious. Brando had spent years reading National Geographic magazines about Tahiti, captivated by what he called the unmanaged faces of the Polynesian people and their natural kindness. The island represented everything he wanted in a filming location: beautiful scenery, warm weather, and a culture that genuinely intrigued him. His decision to choose Tahiti over the desert ultimately changed cinema history, as Peter O'Toole stepped into the Lawrence role and delivered one of the greatest performances ever captured on film. Fact 3. Hugh Griffith vanishes mid-film. If you watch Mutiny on the Bounty carefully, you'll notice something strange about Hugh Griffith's character Alexander Smith. He appears prominently in the early scenes aboard the ship, but then mysteriously vanishes for large portions of the film before briefly reappearing later. This wasn't a creative decision by the filmmakers, but rather the result of a serious behind-the-scenes problem that forced the production team to work around a major casting crisis. Hugh Griffith was a highly respected Welsh actor who had won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor just 3 years earlier for his role in Ben-Hur, making him one of the most prestigious members of the cast. However, Griffith had been struggling with chronic alcoholism for years, and the stress of the troubled Mutiny on the Bounty production, combined with the isolation of filming in Tahiti, made his drinking problem much worse. As filming progressed, Griffith's alcoholism became so unmanageable that it began seriously disrupting the production schedule, which was already plagued by other problems including Marlon Brando's difficult behavior and budget overruns. The situation reached a breaking point when the producers decided they had no choice but to fire Griffith from the film entirely. The firing created a major problem for the filmmakers because Griffith's character was supposed to be present throughout the entire story, including the crucial final scenes on Pitcairn Island. However, his behavior had been considered so disruptive and unprofessional that the producers made the decision to ban him from returning to the island location for any additional filming. This meant that the editors had to work with whatever footage they already had of Griffith, which explains why Alexander Smith appears and disappears so mysteriously throughout the film, creating one of cinema's most noticeable examples of a character vanishing due to real-world production problems. Fact 4. Brando filmed Death on Ice. Marlon Brando's commitment to method acting reached an extreme and physically dangerous level during the filming of Fletcher Christian's dramatic death scene in Mutiny on the Bounty. In the climax of the film, Christian becomes fatally burned while trying to retrieve the ship's sextant from the blazing HMS Bounty, and Brando was determined to make his performance as realistic as possible by actually experiencing the physical sensations his character would feel. To simulate the effects of dying from severe burns, Brando made the decision to film his death scenes while lying on a bed of solid ice. This wasn't a brief moment for a single shot, but extended sequences that required him to remain on the ice for considerable periods while delivering his final dialogue and performing the complex emotional beats of Christian's death. The physical toll this method took on Brando was immediately apparent to everyone on set. The extreme cold caused his skin to turn a disturbing shade of blue as his body temperature dropped dangerously low, creating a genuine health risk that forced the production team to take extraordinary precautions. The crew could only manage to shoot 3 takes at a time before they had to stop filming and allow Brando to warm up and return to normal body temperature. This filming method created significant challenges for the production because it meant that what should have been a straightforward shooting schedule became a slow, start and stop process. Between each set of 3 takes, there had to be extended breaks while Brando recovered from the effects of the ice, warmed up, and prepared for the next round of filming. The crew had to carefully monitor his condition throughout the process to ensure that his dedication to realism didn't result in serious injury or hypothermia during what was already one of the most troubled productions in Hollywood history. Fact 5. Real location, real history. One of the most spectacular and historically authentic moments in Mutiny on the Bounty occurs when the HMS Bounty arrives in Tahiti to be greeted by thousands of enthusiastic native islanders rushing into the water to welcome the ship. What makes this scene truly remarkable is that it was filmed in the exact same location where the real HMS Bounty actually dropped anchor on October 26, 1788, creating a direct connection between the fictional film and the actual historical events that inspired it. The filmmakers went to extraordinary lengths to make this arrival scene as grand and authentic as possible by recruiting 6,000 local Tahitian extras to participate in the sequence. This massive undertaking required coordinating with the entire local community and represented one of the largest crowd scenes ever filmed in the South Pacific. The logistics of managing 6,000 people, providing them with period-appropriate costumes, and directing their movements both on land and in the water created enormous challenges for the production team. The decision to film at the authentic historical location wasn't just about accuracy, but also about capturing the natural beauty and atmosphere that the real sailors would have experienced after their long and difficult voyage from England. The same tropical coastline, crystal-clear waters, and lush vegetation that welcomed Captain Bligh and his crew over a century and a half earlier provided the backdrop for Marlon Brando and his fellow actors. This attention to historical detail extended beyond just the location, as the filmmakers worked closely with Tahitian cultural advisors to ensure that the native customs, dress, and welcoming ceremonies portrayed in the film reflected authentic Polynesian traditions from the 18th century. The result was a scene that not only served the dramatic needs of the story, but also honored the real history and culture of the Tahitian people who played such a crucial role in the original Bounty story. Fact 6. Marriage to 2 Bounty women. Marlon Brando's personal life became strangely intertwined with the Mutiny on the Bounty story in a way that seems almost too coincidental to be real. In 1960, during the pre-production phase of the film, Brando married Movida Castaneda, a Mexican-American actress who had played Tihani, a beautiful Tahitian woman, In MGM's original 1935 version of Mutiny on the Bounty starring Clark Gable and Charles Lawton, Castaneda had portrayed one of the island women who marries a sailor from the Bounty crew, and her role in the earlier film had been significant enough to make her a memorable part of Hollywood's first major adaptation of the story. Her marriage to Brando created an unusual connection between the two film versions, but this was only the beginning of the strange pattern that would emerge. During the filming of the 1962 remake in Tahiti, MGM hired a local woman named Tarita Teripaya to play Mai Miti, Fletcher Christian's Tahitian love interest and the romantic heart of the new film. Tarita had been working as a dishwasher at a local restaurant when she was discovered and cast in what would become her first and only film role. Brando not only personally coached her on her dialogue and performance, but also began a romantic relationship with her during production. The situation reached its conclusion when Brando ended his marriage to Movita in order to marry Tarita on August 10, 1962. This meant that Brando had been married to actresses who played Tahitian women in both major Hollywood versions of the Mutiny on the Bounty story, creating one of the most unusual romantic coincidences in film history. Both women had children with Brando, further cementing the strange connection between his personal life and this legendary maritime tale. Fact 7. The director's mutiny. Carol Reed experienced his own version of mutiny during the production of Mutiny on the Bounty. But unlike Captain Bligh in the story, he ended up profiting handsomely from being overthrown. Reed was originally hired to direct the film based on his impressive reputation as the filmmaker behind classics like The Third Man and Odd Man Out, and MGM believed his skill at working with difficult actors would make him the perfect choice to handle Marlon Brando. However, Reed and Brando clashed almost immediately over fundamental creative decisions about the film. Brando wanted Captain Bligh portrayed as an obvious and unambiguous villain, while Reed preferred a more nuanced interpretation of the character. Brando also insisted on playing Fletcher Christian as an effeminate fop, which Reed felt was wrong for the role. Beyond character interpretation, Reed had serious problems with the constantly changing screenplay and tried to omit certain scenes from the shooting schedule, but MGM executives ordered him to shoot directly from the script regardless of his concerns. The situation deteriorated so badly that Reed attempted to convince production head Saul Siegel to fire Brando on the grounds that the actor was holding up production and making the film impossible to complete. When Siegel refused to remove Brando from the project, Reed asked to be relieved of his duties so he could escape what had become an impossible working situation. Here's where the story takes an interesting financial turn. Siegel initially refused to allow Reed to quit the project, but then the studio head changed his mind and decided to fire Reed instead. This decision proved to be extremely costly for MGM because under the terms of Reed's contract, if he had been allowed to quit voluntarily, he would have received nothing for his time on the film. However, since MGM chose to fire him rather than accept his resignation, Reed was entitled to his full contracted payment of $200,000 for his incomplete work. Fact 8. Brando's champagne flights. Marlon Brando wielded such unprecedented power over the Mutiny on the Bounty production that he essentially turned the entire film into his personal playground, making demands that would be unthinkable for any actor today. His contract with MGM gave him extraordinary control over the project, and he used this authority to indulge in extravagant whims that had nothing to do with making the movie and everything to do with his own entertainment and social life. One of the most outrageous examples of Brando's excess involved his party planning habits during the Tahitian shoot. When he decided to throw lavish parties for himself and his friends, Brando simply ordered MGM to charter entire airplanes and fill them with cases of expensive champagne, whole turkeys, and premium hams, then fly all of this luxury food and drink from the mainland United States directly to Tahiti. These weren't small gatherings but elaborate celebrations that required enormous quantities of imported delicacies that cost the studio tens of thousands of dollars per event. Even more shocking was Brando's decision to literally pull crew members away from their film duties to help with his personal social obligations. When a friend of his was getting married in Tahiti, Brando removed people from the movie's art department, costume department, and other crucial production roles, and reassigned them to work on decorating and organizing the wedding ceremony. This meant that while MGM was paying these professionals to create sets, design costumes, and manage the complex logistics of filming, they were instead arranging flowers and setting up wedding receptions for Brando's acquaintances. These incidents perfectly illustrate how completely Brando had taken control of the production away from the studio executives and directors. MGM found themselves in the position of financing not just a movie, but also Brando's entire social calendar, with no ability to refuse his increasingly ridiculous demands. Fact 9. Richard Harris's sarcastic slap. One of the most memorable behind-the-scenes confrontations during Mutiny on the Bounty occurred during the filming of a scene where Fletcher Christian strikes the sailor John Mills, played by Richard Harris. This particular scene required Marlon Brando to deliver a convincing slap to Harris's face, but what should have been a straightforward piece of physical acting turned into an awkward comedy of errors that perfectly captured the tension between the two actors. On the first take, Brando's slap was so weak and unconvincing that it barely made contact with Harris's face. Instead of simply asking for another take or offering direction on how to improve the scene, Harris decided to express his frustration through sarcasm and theatrical mockery. He responded to Brando's pathetic attempt at stage combat by performing an exaggerated mock curtsy, complete with waggling a limp wrist in the air like a caricature of feminine behavior. Brando completely missed the joke and didn't understand that Harris was mocking him, which led to an even more problematic second take. When Brando's slap was once again weak and ineffective, Harris became more direct in his criticism. He thrust his chin forward aggressively and said, "Come on, big boy, why don't you kiss me and be done with it?" Using profanity to emphasize his point about Brando's lack of commitment to the physical requirements of the scene. This crude suggestion sent Brando into a rage, causing him to glare at Harris with white-hot anger. But Harris wasn't finished with his performance of insubordination. To drive his point home even further, he actually kissed Brando on the cheek, then hugged him and asked sarcastically, "Shall we dance?" This final act of theatrical rebellion was too much for Brando's ego to handle, and he stormed off the set in complete embarrassment, leaving the crew to deal with the fallout from this very public humiliation. Fact 10. Booed at his own premiere. The New York City premiere of Mutiny on the Bounty became one of the most humiliating public experiences of Marlon Brando's entire career, turning what should have been a triumphant celebration into a nightmare that highlighted just how badly the film and his performance had been received by audiences. Brando arrived at the premiere dressed in his naval uniform from the film, clearly expecting to be celebrated as the star of this major MGM production. Instead of the warm reception he anticipated, Brando was met with widespread booing and jeering from the audience as soon as he appeared on screen. The hostile reaction was so intense and sustained that it created an uncomfortable atmosphere throughout the entire theater, making it clear that the audience had already formed negative opinions about both the film and Brando's controversial performance before the movie had even properly begun. The contrast between the audience's treatment of Brando and his co-star Trevor Howard was particularly striking and embarrassing. When Howard appeared on screen as Captain Bligh, the same audience that had been booing Brando erupted into thunderous applause, showing their appreciation for Howard's more traditional and well-received performance. This dramatic difference in reception made Brando's humiliation even more public and painful. The final blow came when Brando's English accent became the target of audience laughter throughout his scenes. His attempt to portray Fletcher Christian as an upper-class British aristocrat had been widely criticized by film critics, but hearing an entire theater full of paying customers actually laughing at his accent during the premiere was more than Brando could tolerate. Unable to endure any more of the public mockery, he made the decision to walk out of his own film's premiere, abandoning the theater while the movie was still playing, and leaving behind one of Hollywood's most memorable examples of a star being rejected by his own audience. Fact 11. Tahiti's only film role. Tahiti Teriapaya's journey from washing dishes in a small Tahitian restaurant to starring opposite Marlon Brando in a major Hollywood production represents one of the most unlikely casting stories in film history. Born in Bora Bora in 1941, Tahiti was working as a dishwasher at a local restaurant when MGM casting directors discovered her during their search for a native Tahitian woman to play Mutiny, Fletcher Christian's love interest in the film. The casting process was particularly important because the filmmakers wanted to ensure authentic representation of Tahitian culture and people, rather than using Hollywood actresses in makeup to portray Polynesian characters. When the casting team found Tahiti, they were immediately struck by her natural beauty and screen presence, but she had absolutely no acting experience and had never appeared in any type of performance before being offered this major role. Despite her complete lack of training or experience, Tahiti's performance as Mutiny was so compelling and natural that it earned her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actress, putting her in competition with established Hollywood performers. This nomination was particularly remarkable considering that English was not her native language, and she had to learn all of her dialogue phonetically while also mastering the complex emotional requirements of her character. What makes Tahiti's story even more unique is that Mutiny on the Bounty remained her first and only film role throughout her entire life. After marrying Brando and having 2 children with him, she chose to step away from the film industry entirely and never appeared in another movie. This means that her single performance, discovered while washing dishes and performed without any prior acting experience, resulted in both a Golden Globe nomination and marriage to one of the most famous actors in the world, making her Hollywood career both incredibly brief and extraordinarily successful. Fact 12. The $750,000 replica ship MGM spared no expense in creating an authentic sailing vessel for Mutiny on the Bounty, commissioning a fully functional replica of the HMS Bounty to be constructed in Nova Scotia at the staggering cost of $750,000. This wasn't simply a movie prop or partial set piece, but a genuine working ship that could actually sail across the ocean, complete with authentic rigging, functional cannons, and all the detailed craftsmanship of an 18th-century naval vessel. The construction project required 400,000 feet of lumber and thousands of yards of canvas that had to be sewn by hand to create the massive sails, making it one of the most ambitious and expensive set pieces ever built for a Hollywood production. The replica was actually built larger than the original HMS Bounty to accommodate the film crew, cameras, and lighting equipment needed for shooting, while still maintaining the authentic appearance and sailing capabilities of a period warship. However, this massive undertaking immediately ran into problems that would plague the entire production. The ship was originally scheduled to be completed in 6 months, but the complex construction process took 9 months instead, creating a 3-month delay that pushed back the entire filming schedule. This delay meant that when the ship was finally ready to sail the 7,000 miles from Nova Scotia to Tahiti, the cast and crew were already on location and had begun filming scenes that didn't require the vessel. The late arrival of the ship created enormous logistical headaches for the production team, who had to completely reorganize their shooting schedule and find ways to keep the expensive cast and crew busy while waiting for their most important prop to arrive. The ship's journey across the Pacific also proved challenging, as the vessel was so small that crew members suffered from constant seasickness, and there was barely enough space for everyone to hide from the cameras during filming sequences. Fact 13. Brando used lifts for height. Marlon Brando's vanity and attention to his screen image extended to details that most audiences would never notice, including his decision to wear lifts in his shoes throughout the entire production of Mutiny on the Bounty. This wasn't a medical necessity or comfort issue, but rather a deliberate choice to ensure that he appeared to be the same height as his co-star Trevor Howard during their many scenes together as Fletcher Christian and Captain Bligh. The height difference between the two actors was significant enough that Brando felt it would undermine his character's authority and presence if audiences could see that Howard was noticeably taller than him. In the story, Fletcher Christian is supposed to be a commanding officer who eventually challenges and overthrows Captain Bligh, and Brando believed that appearing shorter than Howard would make this dynamic less believable and reduce the impact of their confrontational scenes. Wearing lifts for an entire film production presented practical challenges that went far beyond simple vanity. The lifts had to be sturdy enough to support Brando's weight during long days of filming, comfortable enough for him to walk and move naturally in character, and designed to work with the period-appropriate naval uniforms and boots that his character wore throughout most of the film. The costume department had to accommodate these lifts in all of Fletcher Christian's footwear, ensuring that the shoes looked authentic to the 18th century time period while hiding the modern height-enhancing devices. The irony of this situation is that despite Brando's efforts to maintain his physical presence and authority on screen, his performance as Fletcher Christian was widely criticized for being too effeminate and lacking the masculine strength that audiences expected from the character. All of his careful attention to appearing tall enough to match Trevor Howard couldn't compensate for the fundamental problems that critics and audiences had with his interpretation of the legendary mutineer. Fact 14. Billy Wilder's ending suggestion. The dramatic ending of Mutiny on the Bounty, where Fletcher Christian dies trapped in the burning ship while trying to retrieve the vessel's sextant, wasn't the original vision of the filmmakers but rather came from an unexpected source: legendary director Billy Wilder. The ending had been a source of constant debate and rewrites throughout the troubled production, with multiple screenwriters and studio executives unable to agree on how Fletcher Christian's story should conclude. Wilder, who was famous for directing classics like Some Like It Hot and Sunset Boulevard, was brought in as a consultant to help solve the script problems that had plagued the film from the beginning. His suggestion was that Christian should die in a tragic but heroic manner, becoming fatally burned while attempting to save the ship's navigation equipment before the mutineers burned the Bounty to prevent their capture by the British Navy. However, director Lewis Milestone strongly objected to Wilder's proposed ending, believing it was too melodramatic and didn't fit with the tone and character development he had been trying to establish throughout the rest of the film. Milestone felt that the death scene would undermine the more complex moral themes he wanted to explore about the consequences of mutiny and rebellion. The disagreement over the ending created yet another crisis in a production that had already seen multiple director changes and countless script revisions. When Milestone refused to shoot Wilder's suggested death scene, MGM made the decision to bring in a third director, George Seaton, specifically to film Fletcher Christian's final moments. This meant that the climactic death scene was shot in August 1962, more than a year and a half after principal photography had originally begun in November 1960. The result was a film where different directors had handled different portions of the story, contributing to the uneven tone that critics noted when the movie was finally released. Fact 15. The real ship's tragic end. The replica HMS Bounty that was built for the 1962 film lived on for 50 years after its Hollywood debut, continuing to sail the oceans and appearing in other productions including Pirates of the Caribbean, but its story came to a tragic and eerily symbolic end during Hurricane Sandy in October 2012. The ship was caught in the massive storm while sailing off the east coast of the United States and began taking on water as the hurricane's powerful winds and waves overwhelmed the vintage vessel. On October 29, 2012, the Bounty sank in the Atlantic Ocean, and rescue efforts were launched to save the 16 crew members who had been aboard the ship when it went down. 14 crew members were successfully rescued from life rafts and the churning waters. But 2 people lost their lives in the disaster, including the ship's captain, Robin Walbridge, whose body was never recovered. The most haunting aspect of this maritime tragedy was the identity of the second victim, 42-year-old Claudine Christian, who had joined the crew partly because of her personal connection to the ship's historical legacy. Christian was a direct descendant of Fletcher Christian, the real-life officer who had led the original mutiny against Captain Bligh in 1789, making her death aboard the replica ship a strange and tragic echo of the events that had inspired the film. The final images of the Bounty were captured by Coast Guard rescue helicopters, showing only the ship's masts standing above the water as the rest of the vessel disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves. The ship that had been built to recreate one of history's most famous maritime disasters had itself become the center of a real tragedy, completing a circle that connected the original 18th-century mutiny, the troubled 1962 film production, and a 21st-century storm that claimed the lives of 2 people with direct ties to the Bounty's legendary story.